As you know, I'm here on behalf of my family for the purpose of expressing what we believe is the true character of my father.
Do you believe that he killed his wife?
Yes, I do now. It took me many years.
She didn't say a single word for 30 years. Then, in 2024, Sidney Simpson did something that shook the entire O.J. Simpson story back to life. And it wasn't what anyone expected. People online wanted a confession, a tearful reveal, maybe even validation of their darkest theories. Instead, Sidney gave the opposite, a quiet legal move that rejected the viral narratives and distanced her from the media circus surrounding her father's estate. It was subtle, controlled, almost surgical, and suddenly everyone realized her silence might be the loudest evidence of all. So, what exactly did Sidney say? And why is her refusal more revealing than any dramatic statement? The silence that spoke louder than testimony. For decades, Sidney Simpson was the human ghost in America's most documented criminal saga. Cameras hunted for her, tabloids chased her down hallways, and investigative journalists treated any restaurant sighting like breaking news. Yet Sidney seemed to understand something the media never figured out. If she simply stopped talking, people would eventually start interpreting the silence for her. And irony, perhaps cruelty, is that they did. Even before the 2024 probate filing, her withdrawal became its own kind of message. As analysts combed through legal documents and family estate disputes, they noticed a pattern. Not rebellion, not cooperation, but strategy. Her refusal to serve as executor wasn't emotional. It was a calculated distance. Had she stepped into the role, every motion, every signature, and every lawyer comment would have been weaponized into Sidney speaks on the case. Declining wasn't retreat. It was a boundary, and that boundary became what people interpreted as her truth. Because if she really believed the version of events the internet wants her to accept, guilt, betrayal, hidden knowledge, why would she shield herself with silence? And if she believed the opposite, why not defend the legacy that once protected her? That paradox is where viewers, critics, and theorists started projecting their own stories. In Reddit discussions and TikTok breakdowns, one narrative said that Sidney was the inadvertent victim who learned that silence was the only place she could live without being torn apart. But others pushed darker theories that her silence is discomfort, denial, or emotional distance from a version of events she could never publicly reconcile. Here's where we must draw the line, not because speculation isn't seductive for audiences, but because accountability requires clarity. No public record shows Sidney confirming hidden guilt, secret knowledge, or explosive revelations. What exists instead is behavior, and behavior invites interpretation. And interpretation, fair or unfair, became the ecosystem she lives inside. Remember that one photograph from the early 2000s, Sidney, with her head down, sunglasses on, walking fast? Tabloids captioned it, "Sidney in hiding." It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. She was just walking to a car. Yet that's the cage she inherited. Mundane actions became metaphor. But here's where the awful truth many viewers expect gets twisted. The awful truth isn't about what Sidney might know. It's about what she can never say. If she defends her father publicly, she is accused of denial. If she criticizes him publicly, the world pivots her into betrayal. If she says nothing, the silence becomes conspiracy fuel. The chessboard only had losing squares. So she disappeared. New name, new state, new life. Real estate agents in Florida whispered about this quiet buyer who always stayed off camera. Church communities described her as polite but private. She raised her dog, built a career, and became, ironically, successful without ever leveraging the Simpson name. This wasn't a failure to speak. It was mastery of vanishing. Still, despite building a life ordinary people would envy, the public wanted her to perform something impossible, deliver closure to a story that was never hers to write. That is why her 2024 legal action landed like thunder. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. It was a simple refusal. A line in legal language that quietly said, "I won't carry the myth for you." Commentators expected interviews, podcasts, and memoirs. Instead, she let bureaucracy do the talking. Some saw this as maturity. Others saw it as a rejection of everything associated with the Simpson legacy. And then there were the theory builders, the ones who stitched her silence into narratives far bigger than her. psychological trauma, suppressed truth, repressed memories. But here again, the line matters. None of those theories is verified. They are projections from a society still trying to solve a case that was ruled closed decades ago. So this leaves us not with answers, but with the central tension. Sydney's silence was not passive. It was tactical. It became her survival language. And the very refusal to speak became what people misinterpreted as the confession they demanded. What if the real awful truth she confirmed wasn't about the crime, but about us, a public addicted to extracting confession where none exists? The estate disclaimer, a powerful act of rejection. When O.J. passed away on April 10, 2024, in Las Vegas, the world expected one last media storm. Cameras waited for grieving statements, public tributes, and maybe a new legal battle over his belongings. Instead, something almost invisible happened, and it changed everything. Quietly, far from the microphones, Sydney Simpson made what many online observers describe as one of the most symbolic rejections in modern celebrity history. She didn't fight for control of his name, didn't step forward as his heir, and didn't rush for rights or royalties. According to filings discussed in Florida legal circles, she declined beneficiary recognition and asserted agency over one thing: memory. Public reporting never splashed that choice across headlines, but people who tracked estate language noticed one unexpected note reflecting her stance. It suggested she was choosing what would stay in her life and what would not. It echoed publicly circulated sentiment that sounded almost poetic, that she reserved the right to decide which identity she carried forward, and it wasn't the one tied to her father's legacy. Whether crafted by her lawyer, paraphrased in online discourse, or interpreted from filings, the messaging hit like a thunderclap. And here is the eerie part. If you were hoping for a confession or media interview, this move spoke louder. Estate lawyers say rejecting inheritance isn't just emotional distance, it is legal distance. It marks the separation of financial interest, future rights, image usage, association, executor authority, and even residual income. Sydney didn't just walk away from money, she walked away from the shadow. People started asking, why would anyone turn down wealth that could erase stress forever? What do you know or feel so deeply that you'd rather carry nothing forward than take a piece of the empire? Viewers thought they knew Sydney as silent, guarded, and protective. Suddenly, she appeared decisive, almost defiant. Then the story sharpened even more when talking about her brother Justin mirrored the same pattern. Analysts saw in the filings the suggestion that both adult children had no appetite to inherit anything. No fight, no counterclaim, no attempt at control. The rumored advisor on the estate, Wells Fargo, would not publicly confirm that the estate was effectively frozen because of heir disinterest, but the narrative circulating on legal blogs painted a strange picture: an estate sitting untouched, unclaimed, unwanted. To many watching, this wasn't indifference, it was a message. If Sydney spoke through silence for 30 years, this was her first sentence, and it was rejection. Think about that for a second. People wait their whole lives for an inheritance. They fantasize about it. Sydney did the opposite. She opted out, not with a tell-all book, not with press conferences, with a signature declining connection. That move carried more weight than any verbal confession because it was binding, it was recorded, it was intentional, and it fueled speculation. Was this her final boundary with everything the public ever projected onto her? Was this her way of correcting the narrative without saying faux truth? Or this is where late-night audience theories spark. Was this symbolic accountability? A daughter distancing herself from a family identity she never asked for? The legal world noticed too. Lawyers describe estate disclaimers as one of the most decisive forms of separation, stronger than distancing statements or social silence. You're not just closing a door, you're ripping out the hinges. The emotional reading of Sydney's move almost overshadowed the financial one. People felt something shift. They sensed intention. This wasn't profit-driven. This was identity-driven. It's as if she said, without ever speaking publicly, "I will choose what defines me." And when viewers digested that, a new new question rose fast. If this disclaimer was her loudest act yet, did something else exist behind it? People began circulating rumors of an affidavit, an alleged document that supposedly fills in the missing explanation for her actions. Some online forums swear it exists, others insist it's fiction. But if a symbolic legal rejection was this striking, what would an affidavit, real or rumored, actually say? And why did its whispers grow right as she distanced herself from her father's estate? Because if Sydney's disclaimer was the loudest statement she's ever made, then what exactly is inside the so-called hidden affidavit people online claim to have discovered? Separating fact from fiction. If you've been down the rabbit hole, you've almost certainly seen the clips. Grainy, urgent, the narrator promising a bombshell affidavit from Sydney Simpson saying she saw her father covered in blood. Those videos get clicks because they offer closure, a neat ending to a story that has haunted TV for 30 years. But here's the thing. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary proof, and in this case, the proof just isn't there. Let's walk this through like real investigators. First, the loudest viral videos base their case on vague sourcing and unnamed documents. They point to an affidavit circulating online and to a Florida-based bereavement group as if that alone is a smoking gun. But no major newsroom, none of the outlets that would treat that as front-page national news, ran a verified story about such an affidavit. When something that would reshape a decades-old criminal narrative appears, mainstream outlets dig in fast. They did not dig into a Sydney affidavit. That absence alone is meaningful. Second, don't ignore the legal and practical reasons this claim is suspect. In 1994, Sydney was 8 years old, and juvenile records plus privacy protection kicked in hard around children connected to criminal cases. Any statement by a minor, especially one that would have been used in a criminal proceeding, would be documented in court records and would have surfaced in reporting long before now if it existed. And remember how high-profile the Simpson trial was? For anything like a sworn child affidavit to be real, it would have been a historical needle in the haystack of coverage. It simply doesn't line up. Third, the videos themselves often recycle the same lines of speculation, that an affidavit was hidden, that mainstream outlets covered it up, and that some shadow group verified it. That pattern is classic for rumor ecosystems. When someone stays silent for decades, rumors start to fill the blank space. People prefer a dramatic confession because it wraps the story into a loop they can share. But rumor is not evidence. So, what can we verify? The more grounded reporting shows a consistent picture. The estate complication after OJ's death, ongoing claims by the Goldman family, and activity in probate records. The estate is messy, and the children's legal choices around beneficiary status, image rights, and estate claims are legitimate avenues for making a public statement without ever going on camera. That's important because it explains why a legal filing or waiver would be a real, verifiable action, while an affidavit claiming eyewitness trauma would be a different animal entirely. There's also another wrinkle. Interviews and personal testimony from people who actually knew Sydney. A publicly circulated interview from years ago with an ex-boyfriend suggested she believed her father was innocent. Tabloid coverage can be messy, sure, and those sources require caution, but they still show the larger truth. Sydney's private life has complicated layers, and people close to her have given mixed impressions. One person's memory of her belief does not equal legal proof of anything, but it does remind us there are human realities that don't map cleanly onto viral narratives. Now, why does this matter for you, the viewer scrolling at midnight? Because if you want to sound credibly informed in group chats, you need to know how to weigh claims. Ask, is the source named and traceable? Is the document available in court records? Would major outlets be able to confirm it quickly? If yes, it's worth sharing. If no, treat it as a rumor worth interrogating, not amplifying. Let's also talk about motive. Why would someone push the affidavit story? Sensationalism draws attention, ad dollars, and subscribers. It's an endless loop. Every unverified claim prompts a fresh wave of engagement, which trains creators to chase the next viral twist. The moral is simple. Silence creates a vacuum. The internet rushes in to fill it with the story it wants. There's an important legal distinction that keeps getting lost. Refusing an estate is not an admission of guilt. People conflate emotional choices with confessions because they want narrative convenience. The kinds of legal steps Sydney is reported to have taken are consistent with someone protecting their emotional life and privacy. Legally disclaiming an inheritance severs financial and intellectual ties. It can block image rights, royalties, and the messy public business of being associated with a controversial name. That is very different from a sworn statement about a crime. Finally, let's be honest about the power of silence itself. People read meaning into it because it's all they have. Some interpret silence as guilt, others see it as dignity. Both are projections. The truth is likely prosaic. She chose privacy, and that choice was misread, sensationalized, and then weaponized into alternate histories by creators hungry for traction. So where does that leave us now? We can dismiss the loudest conspiracy claims confidently because they lack verifiable evidence. We can accept that Sydney's legal moves are real and symbolically significant, and we can recognize that some accounts from people who knew her hint at personal belief systems that complicate any tidy interpretation. Which brings us to the next core question. If Sydney didn't sign a blood-soaked affidavit, what exactly was she saying when she moved through the legal system and publicly refused ties to her father's estate? The answer is not a single sentence. It's a pattern of choices that together create a message. The real story: identity, trauma, and reclamation. Sydney's real revelation wasn't a bombshell interview or an emotional confession on camera. It was quieter than that. Almost invisible unless you were paying attention. Her confirmation was her life, who she chose to be, separate from the man whose name swallowed headlines for decades. And when you trace that path, you start to see how identity becomes rebellion, how silence becomes language, and how reclaiming your story is sometimes louder than speaking. Imagine inheriting a surname that unlocks conversations nobody would ever dare ask another child. One side of Sydney's bloodline was Nicole Brown Simpson, a mother remembered for warmth and tragedy. The other was O.J. Simpson, a sports icon turned cultural lightning rod. As she grew older, she didn't get to decide which parent people saw on her face. The public made that decision for her. She wasn't Sydney anymore. She was the daughter of the accused, the living evidence of a case that refused to die. Nicole's sisters said it out loud recently when they broke their own silence after O.J.'s death. They weren't speaking to reopen wounds. They were honoring Nicole and protecting Sydney and Justin the way their mother could no longer. They admitted they had been told after the verdict to smile around the children, to hide their grief, and to pretend everything was fine because their pain might damage those kids forever. Sydney witnessed that performance. She saw adults swallow heartbreak in order to shield her. That becomes core memory material. You don't forget the moment you learn that truth can be dangerous. So, Sydney made her own version of the truth. She did something most people didn't expect from the daughter of a man at the center of one of the most watched trials in American history. She disappeared, not in a dramatic vanishing act, not in tabloids running, "Where is she now?" stories that paint her as fragile or broken. She just moved with intention. She went to Florida. She built a real estate company. She started dating, then parenting, the way regular adults do. Her life didn't read like a sequel to her father's story. It read like someone actively rewriting algorithm results attached to their name. If you watch closely, her decisions look strategic. She didn't milk her identity for brand deals, podcast interviews, or memoir money. She didn't sit for sitting down with Oprah moments. She worked, bought property, built friendships outside Los Angeles. People finally saw a simple truth that was hiding in plain sight. She wasn't trying to escape her past. She was trying to build a present that wasn't dictated by it. And then came her quietest loud move. When O.J.'s estate filings became public and everyone online leaned in, waiting for a juicy twist, Sydney did the opposite of what the narrative demanded. She opted out. She didn't fight for the money associated with her father's name. That might seem like paperwork, But psychologically, it was a declaration. She refused to benefit from the same tragedy that forced her childhood into a courtroom. That's the kind of confirmation people overlook, because it isn't sensational, but it's seismic if you understand trauma. In interviews, the Brown family hinted at this too. When Nicole's sisters were asked what they wished people knew about the children, they talked about the complexity. Growing up with strangers projecting guilt, innocence, blame, and conspiracy theories onto your father isn't just heavy. It erases who you are. Sydney carried that weight without speaking it. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was self-respect. In May 2024, one sentiment in the Brown family statements stood out. Sydney, they suggested, chose to keep her mother, not as a myth, but as an internal compass. Without saying anything publicly, she aligned her identity with Nicole's legacy instead of OJ's fame. That small sentence carries the kind of emotional math you don't process overnight. It takes years of therapy, journaling, choosing friends carefully, deciding what you will inherit and what you will bury. Some insiders say Sydney's life in Florida is fuller than anyone gives her credit for. She has a circle, she has agency, she has her own kids. She smiles in grocery stores without paparazzi lenses lurking behind car windows. That life wasn't handed to her. It was designed. That's her rebellion, taking the last name that turned into a headline and choosing to make it invisible. People always ask why she never told her side of the story. But maybe the question is wrong. Maybe her life is her statement. The estate disclaimer, the privacy, the choice to parent without theatrics. It is the rejection of the narrative the world tried to write for her. It's her saying, "I am not a chapter in his book, I am writing my own." And ironically, this is where the awful truth surfaces. It wasn't about confirming guilt or innocence, it was about confirming identity. Sydney didn't endorse her father's legacy or his controversies. She aligned herself symbolically with Nicole, the woman whose life was reduced to tragedy, but who, in Sydney's heart, was still simply Mom. That's why her silence became powerful. Sometimes, refusing to explain yourself is how you prove who you are. If she had spoken early, it would have been devoured by tabloids. Now, her quiet adulthood stands like a monument. It says, survival is possible, healing is possible, choosing peace is possible. So now that we understand the reclamation, the question becomes, how did this all start? What formed this psychological battlefield long before Sydney even knew the world was watching? To answer that, we have to rewind to the night everything changed. What exactly happened in that original moment that set Sydney on this path? The night it all changed, June 12, 1994. Sydney was 8 years old, asleep upstairs while history unraveled on the wrong side of the door. We talk a lot about the trial, the white Bronco chase, and the verdict, but rarely about that night through the eyes of a child. Nicole Brown Simpson was 35. Ron Goldman was 25. What happened outside that condo didn't just end 2 lives. It detonated a life story for the children inside it. When police arrived, the scene was brutal enough to define the next decade of American media. And here is the detail that almost nobody includes in their hot takes. Officers didn't let Sydney and Justin see anything. Before the tabloids could print a headline, and before conspiracy theorists could invent a storyline, police slipped upstairs, removed the kids, and shielded them from the bodies discovered just after midnight on June 13th. That decision shaped Sydney's life more than viewers realize. In the public mind, she was part of the scandal. In reality, she was a protected juvenile witness who legally could not be dragged into the circus. Think about that for a second. The world debated guilt, motive, DNA, race, and fame. But those kids were legally sealed away behind juvenile confidentiality rules. They weren't in Oprah interviews. They weren't on trial footage. Their trauma was invisible by design. Fast forward a year. October 3rd, 1995. Sydney is 9. Justin is 6. America sits on edge for the verdict. Millions glued to TVs. Schools pause classes. People cheer, people scream, and people cry. But for these children, the reaction wasn't political or cultural. It was confusing. They were old enough to understand something enormous was happening, yet too young to comprehend how their family name suddenly became a lightning rod for every TV debate and late-night punchline. Immediately after Nicole's funeral and the verdict, the children were placed with Nicole's sisters. Eventually, custody shifted through complicated family agreements that never made it into headline graphics. Sydney grew up watching adults argue over a story the world thought it owned, while she was supposed to pretend it was normal. Everyone debated forensic timelines, glove theories, and slow-motion footage of the Bronco chase. Yet nobody was debating how a fourth grader processes strangers chanting their father's name like a football game. That's the hidden chapter mainstream coverage never gave viewers. And maybe that is why Sydney years later refused documentary roles, interview invitations, and court TV cameos. She wasn't just guarding privacy, she was guarding psychological reconstruction work ordinary people never saw. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was survival. Here's where it gets interesting. Today, Sydney is in her 30s with a family of her own. She built her life in Florida, working quietly and intentionally stepping outside the very media ecosystem that made her existence public property. Some journalists framed that as suspicious, others called it protective. But if you look through the lens of childhood trauma and the verdict hanging over her name, another interpretation emerges. Her distance from the spotlight is itself the statement, a rejection of narratives built by strangers. This is the irony. The so-called awful truth isn't a confession or a secret diary entry. It's how living in silence became Sydney's power move when society expected spectacle. Every non-interview, every legal filing declining public comment was a quiet response to 30 years of people asking her to relive a night she never saw but was defined by anyway. And this raises a deeper question. If a child grows up inside America's most infamous case and chooses a life engineered away from fame, is that silence an escape, a shield, or the only form of truth she ever had control over? Because now the question shifts. Sydney has a new generation looking up at her, free from the courthouse steps and tabloid frenzy. She is the only person who knows the real cost of growing up in the shadow of a verdict millions cheered for or hated. So where does she go from here? Today, she is a mother, a homeowner, and a woman who rewrote her identity without a camera present. But what does that future look like now that the narrative is hers to define? Because if silence shaped her past, what will Sydney Simpson say with the next chapter of her life? The silent confirmation. So here's the thing. When we say Sydney Simpson confirmed the awful truth, we're not talking about some shocking confession or a tell-all interview. There were no explosive statements, no dramatic courtroom reveal. The confirmation came through her choices. Legal steps, personal boundaries, and the quiet, deliberate way she's protected her life and her mother's memory for over 30 years. That's how she spoke without saying a word. And there's the lesson. Sydney's journey isn't just about surviving the shadow of a trial that captivated the world. It's about trauma, resilience, and reclaiming your story. Millions debated O.J.'s guilt, dissected every glove, every chase, every slip-up. But Sydney's truth was lived in silence, in small daily victories, in refusing to let the media or public speculation define her. That's a power move few notice, but it's one of the clearest statements of all. Nicole Brown Simpson's legacy lives on too, through her sisters and through documentaries that finally let her story breathe beyond tabloid headlines. Netflix, interviews, memorials, they remind us she was more than a statistic. She was a woman with dreams, friends, and a family that fought to ensure she was remembered with dignity. Sydney's silence intersects with that legacy, showing us that honoring a parent doesn't always mean telling the world everything. Sometimes it's about living fully, quietly, authentically. And yet, the case remains unresolved in many ways. Questions linger, debates flare online, and America's fascination hasn't faded. But within that noise, Sydney's choices offer a different perspective. The awful truth isn't a headline or an argument, it's that she survived. She thrived. She chose her mother's memory over the weight of her father's legacy, navigating a life most of us couldn't imagine. So maybe the bigger question we all need to ask ourselves is this: what does it really mean to protect your story when the world wants to own it? What does it mean to claim agency over trauma that everyone else treats like entertainment? That's it for today, guys. Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more.